All right, Gooners, welcome back to Gooner Pavilion. And yeah, it's been a week. The Arsenal had a North London derby in Asia. Now, make what you will of that. That was something. And listen, you never want to lose to Tottenham, no matter where. Whether it's in space, it's underground, it doesn't matter. You just don't lose to Tottenham. But we lost. So today I want to talk about that game, but I also want to talk about the winger situation in Arsenal, and we'll dive a little bit into that. And then we will look ahead at the next preseason game at the Emirates. I will be there on Wednesday to watch Arsenal play Villarreal. So that should be interesting, should be good fun. But first of all, the summer so far has been fantastic. Let's not kid about that. I think even I wasn't expecting the summer that we've had. I mean, Zubimendi has been mulling around since January, so we pretty much, felt like that was coming in. And then, of course, it was like we needed to get a striker. And I do like the way, in hindsight is always 2020, right? I do like the way in hindsight Arsenal, went about the business of signing players. And after Zubimendi was signed, we got two signings, well, three signings that no one was looking at. No one expected Arsenal to be looking at those players, let alone sign them. First came Kepa, and we're like, what? What's going on? Another Chelsea signing? What are we doing with Chelsea players? We've had so many of them that have not really turned out, anything. So we're like, okay, Chelsea signing. Okay. Kepa. And listen, right, I'm probably one of the ones that keep banging on about this. I don't see Raya as the number one. It might not be a popular opinion. I might be the minority about this, but I don't see him as a number one. And yes, people are gonna say he's got two golden gloves. I'm looking at you, you know who I'm talking about. He's got two golden gloves, but Ramsdale had a golden glove. And where did Ramsdale end up? Out of Arsenal, just made his way to Newcastle. So I'm pretty excited for him because there's a decent keeper there. And he deserves to be playing at the top level. Mariah for me just still fills me with a lot of um doubts and worry. I mean, we've all seen him in a preseason game. But I digress. So Kepa comes in, uh, and then, out of left field, or more accurately, out of somewhere in London, Brentford, we get a player from Brentford, Christian Norgard. And everyone's like, what? What's going on here? So Norgard comes in, um, and of course, things start rumbling about the party and all of that. So it started to make sense. Okay, we needed somebody else to deputize in that six. So it's going to be a bit like Partey, Jorginho, both gone. There's now Zubimendi and Norgard. I actually think that Norgard will probably start the season. There's just, something about the way that he plays that I think Mikel Arteta will like. So probably keep an eye on that one, but too early for that now. And so after that, then the frustration started, right? Because it was like, is Gyökeres coming? What's going on with the striker situation? Are we going in for Sesko? What's happening there? And it took almost forever to eventually happen. But finally, we got our man, Victor Gyökeres, number 14. We wear the 14 shirt. And listen, we have some very, very high expectations, for this player because if you go and look at the Premier League last season, right, and you look at the goals that were scored, there was no Arsenal player in the top 9 goals. What am I saying? Top, no Arsenal player, no Arsenal player. I'm just scrolling down. There's no Arsenal player in the top 17. And right. And when we say top 17, we're actually probably talking about top 20 or 25 because, there are lots of players that, are tied in that 17 position, right? So you have to go to the third, you have to go to the third sort of slide in that page to find Kai Havertz with 9 goals. We couldn't even crack 10 goals last season. Martinelli scored 8 as well, and we'll come to Martinelli in a second. But I think it has to be commended the fact that we didn't have any player in the top 20 goal scorers last season. We came second. I mean, what does that tell you? And it really just, means that all those guys that keep rubbishing the campaign that Arsenal had last season absolutely do not know what they're talking about. But maybe they do. But it is in fashion, for people to have a dig at Arsenal. And people are going to talk about the fact that Arsenal came second again, to Liverpool. Man City didn't even do too bad in the goal scoring thing in the goal scoring table because Erling Haaland still scored 22 goals last season. So it would certainly put Arsenal in those top goal scoring charts for certain. Does that mean that that fixes all the problems for Arsenal? I don't think so. I don't believe for 1 second that it does. We'll score more goals, but probably our net goals will probably be the same. Because we've lost, a couple of people that contributed goals. We lost Partey. Martinelli has gone down a little bit in terms of goals. Saka was injured, so we're waiting to see whether he's fully fit this season. But once you start having injuries the way that Saka has had, you know that an injury is always lurking around. So, step in Noni Madueke, another Chelsea player, where we were like, hold on a second, why are we going for another Chelsea player again? This is crazy. What has Chelsea got over Arsenal that not only do we get their players, we pay over the odds for the player. 50 something million for Noni Madueke, and you're thinking, how's that possible? Right? Because we're looking at Madueke and we're thinking, okay, maybe Jao Pedro set the scene, for how much a player was going to cost. And then there was Elanga as well, and then Cunha as well. So it was almost like anybody that was going in this window was going to be going for around that price. Okay, fair enough. Noni Madueke comes in. I've got high expectations for him, but that brings me to my next topic, and which is really about the wingers in Arsenal. Because if you look at social media, they're pretty much trying to get rid of Gabriel Martinelli. I'm constantly having debates where I feel like I'm defending Martinelli, among group because people just want him to go away. Now, Martinelli scored 8 goals last season, same amount of goals as Trossard, who I think everyone, agrees that doesn't start every single game. But guess who also scored the same amount of goals last season? Bruno Fernandes, right? And Manchester United will tell you that he's one of their best players. He scored 8 goals last season. So, I mean, that's not, exactly, blowing everyone out of the water. And then when it comes to, okay, yeah, you can say that Martinelli is a winger, or more accurately, named a forward, right? Guess who else, also scored 8 goals last season? Hmm? I'll wait. Okay. All right. Any guesses? Eberechi Eze. He scored 8 goals last season too as well. So, I mean, listen, people are going to say, and I'm not silly enough to say that the two are the same. Every player has something different. They bring something to the squad that is unique in terms of their skill set. And we know Eze can go past players, he can make things happen. And he scored 8 in a team like Crystal Palace. And we all respect Crystal Palace, but we don't look at them and say they are creating loads and loads of chances. So you can kind of say that sort of balances itself out. But here is my point, right? If Mikel Arteta decides to pull the trigger, for Eberechi Eze, I say that it's not just wise, for us not to get rid of Martinelli. I think it's actually a smart thing because what that does is that you can have Martinelli coming to games, when everyone is really tired and he can just stretch the defense, right? And over the season, you start to see battles emerges, which left back, does very well with some right backs. And I think we've seen over time that Cucurella seems to have something with Saka, always seems to have a way of neutralizing Saka as well. And a few, players, where there's battles like that. So I think that even if you've got newcomers coming in, Noni Madueke, flair and creativity, you got Eberechi Eze was involved in, let's put that all together, 25 goals last season. They're all exciting prospect, but I think adding to the squad, should be exciting for us and should create the kind of depth that every club should dream of. And I think, if you look at with Arsenal competing in the Champions League, the Premier League, the FA Cup, and League Cup, that's a lot of matches. And I think Mikel Arteta would understand that everyone is screaming now that Arsenal needs to win something, right? They need to win something. So rotation is going to be key. And for me, I did do a video about things that I want to see from Mikel Arteta in next season, and this is one of them: trusting the bench. For so long, Mikel Arteta has not been able to trust his bench for whatever reason. And we go into games and we can't bring in someone from the bench to make a difference. And very few times do we make substitutions and they actually impact the game. But I think now you've got players that could actually do that. Havertz could come off the bench, make a difference, right? And you could keep Gyökeres fresh, throughout the season. So for me, I would be substituting Gyökeres in the first 10, 12 games of the season, right? Keeping him fresh, getting him into the swing of things because we're going to need him in the tail end of the season. And the same with Saka as well. Saka deserves a rest. If Madueke comes in and shows a bit of promise, by the way, I hope that I do see Madueke on Wednesday playing, starting with Saka on the bench because we know what Saka is going to give you. Saka is a starter, but I think we need to see what Noni Madueke can bring and see what they can really challenge. Saka there. So I think that rotation is going to be key, not for making impact on the pitch alone. I think that it would also do something in terms of reducing injury risk. How many times do people say that we played Saka too long, too much, too many times last season, and that contributed to Saka being injured for 4 months, right? And for me, that's critical because, in my opinion, Saka is the best player in Arsenal. Now, if you say to me that Odegaard is the best player, I'm not going to disagree with you because I think they're one and two, and you can swap, which one, whatever the day of the season is. You can say Saka's one, Odegaard's two, Odegaard's one, and Saka's two. I'm not mad about that. Um, but for me, I think that we need to create a squad where every player has a role, where competition drives excellence, and where Arsenal can compete on all fronts without missing a beat, because that's the kind of depth that really turns a good team into a great one. You look at Liverpool last season, and that front line, they had players that could come in. You had Gabriel, you had Diaz, you had Jota, may so rest in peace. You had, Salah, as well. You had Nunez, who had, that crazy game against Newcastle, where he came in and was just, doing ridiculous stuff, right? And don't forget Javi Elliott, right? Javi Elliott, is was one of the players that actually contributed quite a bit, to Liverpool's title hunt. I do hear that he might be leaving, Liverpool this season. And it will be really, really interesting because now I don't think that anybody can judge Slot based on the first season. And it's the same argument that people discounted Arteta because they said, well, it wasn't his team and he went ahead and won the FA Cup. Right. And you could also say, Slot, that wasn't your team and you went ahead and won the Premier League. Now that you're changing your teams and bringing in players that you actually want, let's see how good a manager you are. I think he's a good manager, but I do want people to hold the same energy, for Slot throughout the season as well. And remember, and I'll be here to remind you guys on the podcast if people are not doing exactly that. So listen, that's Arsenal, winger situation. I think that we can do better. I think that both players will be better this season. I would hate to see either Martinelli or Trossard go, but I do understand if one of them goes. But I would make the case, for Martinelli not to leave, as well. Okay, so let's look at the North London derby that was in Asia. Very, very interesting. When I saw the fixture list for our preseason games and I saw Newcastle, I saw, Spurs, and I thought, goodness me, these are players that would have they'll have no problem whatsoever kicking Arsenal players, all the way into the season, right? And I thought those games would be really, really dangerous because Newcastle, listen, Newcastle, there's no love lost between us and Newcastle, let's be clear. Um, excuse me, we always seem to struggle against Newcastle, especially, at St. James Park. I used to live in Newcastle actually, very, very close to St. James Park in my student days. And I used to see, the Toon Army, come in their droves, into the stadium. I remember back then, you always wanted to avoid the train stations because, Newcastle fans were loud, they were noisy, and they always seemed to get into it with Sunderland fans. At that time, Sunderland used to be in the Premier League, but, I digress. So Newcastle, we knew was always going to be a very, very tough physical game. You've got Joe Linton, who can be a bully on the pitch. So glad Max Doman stood up to him as well. I'll love to see, those players clash again. I'm sure Joe Linton will be keeping an eye on Max Doman. But that was a decent game. Arsenal won that game after going a goal behind, as well. But Let's talk about our North London derby. The team that Mikel Arteta, used there was, it was a strong team. Although there was a lot of fluidity, in that front. There were lots of times that Martinelli was running through the center, playing as that focal point. And I have spent a lot of time, on the right hand side. So it felt like Arsenal were playing like two tens a little bit because Saka was coming in into that middle a lot more, while Martinelli was just keeping the width, every now and then. And then, I thought for me, that game was a game where it starts to show some of the problems that and questions that Mikel Arteta will need to answer this season against teams like Spurs, who have looked at last season and said, how did teams make life difficult for Arsenal? And how did teams neutralize the Arsenal and then try and nick a goal? And that was the blueprint. It is the blueprint in the Premier League. Everyone has used it against Arsenal. Whether it's Newcastle, whether it's Brentford, at the time, whether it's West Ham or it's Crystal Palace. Listen, it is a tried and tested formula. And if something works, you've got to keep using it until the other person shows you that, their resistance to it. Why should other teams change when they come and play Arsenal? And that is the low block with six players always dropping into that defense, right? And they say, yeah, break us down if you want. Because if you're crossing the ball in, it's going to be one of our players. How many times in that game did we get into the final third and then it was a shot deflected by a player? It was a player in the way of a shot. You know, I know the stats will say that Arsenal only had one shot on target. That was because there were a lot of Spurs players, in between, the goal and Arsenal, just blocking and intercepting and all of that. And listen, once you do that to Arsenal, you do make them a little bit desperate. And so I think that that's a question that Mikel Arteta needs to solve. By that showing against North London Derby opponents, Tottenham, he hasn't solved that yet. Personnel are changing, but it is still something. And I guess that goes down to a system, how coaches like to play. I think that is still a problem that Mikel Arteta needs to solve in the season coming. So clearly, from Arsenal perception, that's something that we need to do. But listen, I haven't talked a lot about the results. It was a 1-0 defeat. Just focusing on the performance and what I saw on the pitch. Saliba for me was still very good. He's still one of our best, players, still one of our best defenders. And honestly speaking, I think he just makes every other player that plays beside him a bit better. Kivio was decent as well. It was good to see Mosquera, come in for a couple of minutes as well. Don't have much to say about him in this game. I think a lot of that will come in future games. Right? Probably the one that we see at the Emirates. Maybe he starts that game as well. Miles Lewis Kelly was decent, except for the time when he lost the ball and that, got to a goal. But hey, this is Raya, right? Um, it was the exact same thing Crystal Palace did with John Philip Mateta scoring the goal that drew that game last season. But I think we're going to see lots of that. We're going to see lots of that because Mika will not change and Raya will not change. I would just want his decision making to be a little bit better, because when you pass that ball straight down the middle, right, and you've got three players, coming together. Basically, Brentford set a trap, for Miles Lewis Kelly because they understand that he always likes to take the ball in a half turn and want to go forward. So what do? You come in from the angles and you can nick the ball off. And Raya should be more, you know, attuned, smarter than that, than to pass the ball into the trap that Brentford set. And listen, lots of teams are going to set that trap for Arsenal because we like to pass it from the back. But passing it from the center into the center, hasn't really always worked for Arsenal, especially when players are under pressure. Partey was one player that used to be able to do that and then, get around players, but he's gone now. But even he always sometimes didn't always get it right. I'm not a fan of it. Passes to the wings, right? And so if it gets intercepted, at least the player has an awkward, shot towards the goal. But if you pass it in the center and they lop it in like what they did, you always have a chance, and a great goal by Sa, as well. But I take nothing from that game. It was just a preseason friendly. Tottenham can, create their CDs, already about that. But guys, it's been a good week, I would say, for Arsenal. Should be back in the UK now, rested, putting their training in. I imagine they probably get a day or two rest, and then they start training again ahead of that game on Wednesday. Probably start training today, which is Saturday, or tomorrow as well. So it'll be interesting to see how that goes. Will Arsenal do more in the transfer window? Probably. Eberechi say doesn't seem to be going away, but I don't see that happening, anytime soon. I think if that signing is going to happen, it's probably going to be a late one. Because Crystal Palace need to come to terms with the fact that Eberechi is leaving. I don't believe that they have. Then they need to sign players potentially to replace him. And then they might want to dig their heels in, for the release clause of that 60 million plus 8 million add-ons, or is it 10 million add-ons. I hear stories that release clause expired last night, so it remains to be seen, what Crystal Palace want to do going forward. But guys, appreciate all of you. If you've been here this far, make sure to subscribe, and hit that like button as well. And more importantly, share your thoughts on Arsenal's winger situation, or on the North London derby, or what do you think our prospects will be this season. Until the next time, take care of yourself.